Go for it.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the work session of the Board of County Commissioners for June 28th, 2021. And if you will all join me for the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, first thing we have on our agenda is our Local Emergency Planning Committee, the LEPC, and with Mr. Spratland today, we have Mr. Gablehouse. Correct, Tim? All
Yep.
right, Mr. Spratland, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thanks for entertaining us. Won't be too long. It's basically, I invited Tim Gablehouse down. I'm going to let him give his dossier. It's very impressive. He's been around. Me and Tim have known each other 20-something years. He's the attorney for local emergency planning committees and assists all of us throughout 64 counties, and also regional emergency planning committees. So I thought a good time right now would be to give you all a brief on what that does and the liabilities that it pretty much saves us by being part of this committee. We've got one now, but we're planning on making a Montezuma County local emergency planning committee. And we'll still keep the regional one going, but we kind of want our own. We've got a lot of stuff going on, so we'll explain more of that. But I'll let Tim take off and tell us who you are and where you're headed, boss.
Thanks, Jim. So local emergency planning committees were originally created under a federal statute called the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act, which was passed back in the 80s.
Is that mic on?
Says it is.
Okay.
I can.
Want to get closer?
Hello?
Tap it? Yeah.
You're good.
Okay.
Okay. That statute was originally passed as a result of the Bhopal incident in India. Congress at the time decided that local communities in the United States weren't adequately prepared for these kinds of emergencies. Time has marched on, of course, and so now we sit here today, post 9/11, in a world where everyone is now focused on all hazards from a community preparedness point of view. The other thing that statute required the creation of is a State Emergency Response Commission. I sit on the State Emergency Response Commission and have been on it now for quite a while. Used to be an appointee of the governor on that. It's now an appointment that's being done by Executive Director of the Office of Public Safety. So that's where we sit in that regard. I am also a past president board member of a national group, a nonprofit entity that represents CERCs and LEPCs nationwide on policy matters. So that's where I come from, this perspective I come from. The point of this talk is to make sure I highlight for you the advantages of having an LEPC, why it's a really good thing to avoid potential liabilities, and a very good thing to avoid litigation against the county. So it has substantial advantages. So if you can give me the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So the question that always gets asked is, so how do we evaluate whether emergency management's doing a good job? What's the point of this process? How do we measure success? The questions we'd like to answer are communities aware and prepared? Well, the short answer is maybe. Depends on what community you're in, depending on what kind of risks you're talking about. Different communities have different levels of awareness for various things, be they hazardous materials running in tanker trucks down the road, hazardous materials in storage, wildland fire, flood, you name it. Depends a lot on the history of that community as to whether or not their individual citizens, small businesses are aware of it or not. Next question is, are we serving the whole community? Okay, the problem there is frankly, that's the greatest source of potential liability. And the reason that's the best source of potential liability is the people that are going to turn around and sue local governments for failure to do a good job in this arena are people that believe they're not being served by the planning process. In other words, you're not talking to me, you're not evaluating whether or not I can protect myself, protect my family, you're telling me we might need to evacuate, but you don't know if I can evacuate or not. A lot of the litigation and law in this arena came up after Hurricane Katrina, where you had people on their rooftops. Okay, it was a ton of litigation that followed that. But the litigation that was successful was all based on you failed to plan properly for the disadvantaged communities that were served by the pumping districts. It wasn't a matter of the pumps didn't work. It wasn't a matter of the pumping works were abandoned because the flooding was too severe and it was going to endanger the employees. It wasn't so much a matter of, you told me to evacuate, I didn't go because I couldn't. Okay? It really was a matter of I didn't know what the plans were. The plans didn't evaluate whether or not I could perform the assumptions that were in the plans. That's where that litigation arose. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But the last one is, how do we know if we're doing a good job? And I'll talk about that at the end of the presentation, because essentially what I want to do is move on from evaluating how good a job everyone's doing based on the last bad day. 2020 hindsight is no way to evaluate success in emergency planning. You can evaluate response, certainly, but in terms of the adequacy of plans, we need to do that on a little bit different metric. We need to have a better way of doing that than, gee whiz, that last incident didn't go well. Because quite honestly, we don't control any of that. So what I want to do is give you a bit of perspective. Typically, firefighters in the room will always laugh at this slide. And I'll tell you that the picture was taken in Europe. I'm not picking on any local fire department, just to be clear here.
They do things differently over there.
Well, they do and they don't, and nonetheless, standard operating procedure protocol is to lay this out, and I'm pretty sure the train is not going to care, to say the least. So let's talk about perspective, because I think that's important. Okay, we still routinely hurt people, be they employees with chemical products, be they firefighters, be they law enforcement agents and others. And we routinely hurt them on small quantity stuff, not the major catastrophic kinds of incidents. We also tend to look at risk by looking at lists of chemicals and thresholds. Okay? There is no magic to reporting thresholds under Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act or any other statute. They're there for administrative purposes. We count 1-ton cylinders of chlorine for purposes of this statute, knowing full well that smaller quantities are quite capable of killing it. Okay? We do that for administrative purposes. We've also, especially since 9/11, tended to give the public a pass. In part, that's because we don't want to talk to them in a lot of detail about what response plans are. And as a result, every time you buy new apparatus, there's a picture, there's an interview, the public tends to feel like people have got it. Even in the wildfire area, and I live in Greene County now, okay? Even today, you talk to people about wildland fire risk, given the catastrophic fires we had up there last year, and you still get people going, oh, no, I'm not really worried about it this year. I have no idea why. It's clearly irrational. But what we've tended to do is not make the public, small business, people like that, really responsible for their own preparedness. We haven't created that kind of community expectations, which is important. Okay? We've got big planning gaps. Okay? Disadvantaged communities, people that can't evacuate, non-English speaking communities, people that we don't go out and talk to about what our expectations as a community are in terms of their behavior if we have an emergency. Okay? Most everybody says, well, I expect them to follow what I tell them to do. If I tell them to shelter in place, I expect them to shelter in place. If I tell them to evacuate, I expect them to evacuate. But we really haven't spent any effort trying to figure out whether or not people have a clue what shelter in place means. And in fact, there's a lot of data that says they don't. There was a time when people would ask you about what color duct tape they needed. But quite realistically, we make a lot of assumptions in the planning world that are not based on anything other than our own perspective of what common sense is, and the old saying is correct. There's no meeting of the minds on that by any stretch of the imagination. We rely on our SOPs, hence the picture. We rely on the way we used to do it, and we always do it, but we haven't really reevaluated whether or not that's good, bad, or indifferent. Okay, is that still an appropriate procedure, given the nature of the risks, given the changes in the community or otherwise? So it's important, I think, to get out of the mode of evaluating our success based on the last incident, and to also re-examine planning procedures and assumptions. Next slide. All right, so whose expectations on the job count? Well, realistically, our customer is the public, but we tend to spend all our time focused on people that are providing money. Okay, what's FEMA want? What's the state want? Okay. That doesn't necessarily answer the questions of the general public. It doesn't even necessarily serve the public. Are we just chasing money because it's there, or are we actually chasing money that is going towards something that's important in this community? So the last question is important. What are we measuring? Okay, what are we going to evaluate to determine if we're successful? So next slide. All right, so this is an actual quote from a FEMA document. And the last paragraph is the one you want to look at. FEMA has come out and said, yes, you guys are legally responsible for adequate emergency planning in your communities. And there are a bunch of federal judges out there who go, that's true. Okay, so if I'm dissatisfied with the adequacy of emergency planning in my community, okay, first you're going to yell at him, but if you're dissatisfied with that adequacy, that is potentially a civil rights violation. Okay, it's also potentially a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you've got a variety of legal theories that apply to the situation and can be enforced in terms of legally responsible. And where most communities get in trouble is, frankly, they have failed to talk to the whole community. They've failed to try to bring people in and talk about emergency planning and appropriate expectations. Okay? Jim spends a lot of his time trying to assess risks, trying to understand what the capabilities of the community are, and trying to understand where the capability gaps are. Okay? Realistically, if I go out on the street, I'm not going to find anybody that has anything close to that level of understanding of what the situation is in the community. Okay? We don't go out and tell people very often, can't handle that. We have this kind of bad day, you might be on your own. Okay? I meet very few fire chiefs who are really prepared to sit in a room of folks and say, I'm not coming, if that's what's going on. So while you have legal responsibility, the problem here is we're not communicating reality in a way that puts people in a position to understand what their own personal responsibility is, to fully appreciate what the adequacy of the planning is and whether the planning is adequate or not. So the next slide. And it gets better. This document came out actually in 2019. And what it essentially stands for is, if you have a legally mandated essential service, you cannot defer that even during times of disaster. Okay? And it builds on the fact that emergency planning is an inherent responsibility, every level of government, which means if you're going to continue to deliver legally mandated services, and that includes things like the Americans with Disabilities Act and so forth, then you've got to do it by mutual aid. You have to have mutual aid agreements in place that actually work. One of the things that comes up in litigation all the time is, how do you know that's going to work? Well, we haven't done an exercise, we haven't evaluated it, we haven't talked to the segment of the population that would utilize that service, and so it's a guess. And federal judges generally find that to be inadequate. They don't like guesses when it comes to civil rights. So it's important to understand that those two documents are still the law of the land. Okay, where we are in fact creating these obligations at a local government level, we're making local governments quite vulnerable then to people who believe their civil rights are being violated because of the inadequacy of planning. So, next slide. So what standards set the metrics? How are you going to get evaluated in these kind of cases? Well, you have the National Response Framework, you have the National Incident Management System. I'm sure stuff that Jim sleeps with under his pillow. Okay, you have CPG 101, which is the first document, which FEMA issued some time ago. You have the Continuity Circular. You have grant and funding requirements. Okay, every grant comes with long tails of what the obligations are in that regard. You're going to be evaluated against those. National Fire Protection Association has a standard called 1600. Okay, that is a continuity of government kind of standard. Okay, I sit on that committee. We're currently evaluating amendments to that standard, and we'll probably broaden it in many ways. But it will remain the only free standard that NFPA puts out. Okay? And then we have at the international level a document called APPEL. Now, I want to make, before you look at me and go, why do I care about that? The APPEL manual is being used as a handbook for local emergency planning committees across the country. It is emergency planning community right to know for the rest of the planet. The document was issued by the United Nations Environmental Program, and it is basically a handbook on how you do emergency preparedness in the developing world. Okay, so it looks at remote places with no infrastructure and how do you bring communities together to work on those programs. Okay, and in full disclosure, I'm the primary author of that document. So when you look at what goes on internationally, we don't have an EPCRA internationally. What we've got instead are business practices under ISO standards and EU regulations that basically say go forth and do good and follow these kinds of guidance documents in evaluating whether you're doing good. And we're going to figure out whether you're doing good based on what the community says. Okay, not some other independent process. So it becomes kind of interesting, quite honestly. In the U.S., we tend to do command and control regulation. I tell you how high to jump, and then I measure whether you jump that high, and if you do, then that's good enough. Okay. Whether it's good enough or not is an unknown. It's an expensive process. It doesn't necessarily serve communities well. Okay. But that's the way we choose to do things here. The rest of the world has a different approach, as I'm sure you all know. So, next slide. Okay. The job we want to be evaluated on is something we can control, not 20/20 hindsight. Okay? You can't predict where the next fire will occur. You can't predict where the next flood will occur. You can't predict where the next hazardous materials incident is going to occur. Okay? So I don't want to measure our success or failure in emergency planning based on something I have no control over. What I want to do instead is look at a process of improving community preparedness. I want to be able to go outside after working this problem for a while and say, my community is better prepared, yes or no? Okay, now what does that mean? Well, the question is, it's going to mean different things in different communities. Okay? Does preparedness in this rural community mean the capability of evacuating, sheltering, helping your neighbor? Okay, what does it mean here versus what does it mean over here? One size does not fit all, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you whether or not, what kind of preparedness efforts you need here or don't here. Okay, I'm very familiar with the community. My mother grew up between the park and the Mancus, and I still have family there. But so I have some sense of what the problems are from a preparedness point of view, but not perfect knowledge by any stretch of the imagination. So the question is, what are we going to measure? How do we evaluate whether or not we're doing a good job here? So next slide. All right. The growing consensus at this point is that we're going to measure our success on the ability to close capability gaps on preparedness in the community. And the process that we're talking about going through is, first off, identification of risks. Now, I'm not talking pie in the sky stuff, meteor strikes or whatever. I'm talking about what really happens here. Can you get a tanker truck roll over? You bet. Can you have a wildland fire? You bet. Can you have a flood? What are the real live risks that we face in this community? Okay. What are the capabilities of the community to deal with those risks? And when I say community, I mean everybody. I don't mean just hazmat team or firefighters or law enforcement. I mean, if that incident happens next door to somebody's house, what do they do? Okay, do they have any idea on what their course of action should be? Do they have any idea what's going to happen from the government point of view if that incident occurs? You know, what are their expectations? Okay, when I go talk to business leaders in parts of this state, I ask the business leader, okay, you got an employee hurt with a chemical product in your business, right? What are you going to do? And they'll fumble around for a while, and then they'll say, well, I'll call 911. Okay, great. What happens when you call 911? And they'll usually describe something like, Chicago fire arriving on the scene.
You get fire, you get police, you get ambulance, first of all.
Absolutely. They have an expectation that they're going to see the kind of stuff they see on TV. And then I usually look at the sheriff or the fire chief or whatever. So what actually happens? And depending on what community you're in, sometimes you get depends on the time of day, but you might get 2 people in their personal vehicle, bunker gear, and a fire extinguisher. And the ambulance, depending on the time of day, could be half an hour away or more. Okay, so we don't have a meeting of the minds just in terms of expectations. Okay, people generally do not have a good understanding of what reality is in their community, and therefore they don't have a real sense of responsibility on the steps they need to take to take care of themselves. And it's important that we continue to talk about this as a whole of community responsibility. Okay, this burden is not one that is solely on the first responders. Okay, small business owners ought to have flashlights and first aid kits and water. Okay? But we don't go around knocking on doors asking them if they do, and we're not creating an expectation that they should do it. Okay? The next step is a community-wide process, which is, what are the community's desired capabilities? That is a discussion that needs to occur throughout the people that are impacted by the emergency plan. Okay? Okay, we can't do this if this event happens. So what do you think our priorities ought to be? What should our capabilities be? Because you can't eat this elephant in one bite. We're going to strategically plan to fill capability gaps based on community priorities. Okay, the state's not going to tell you what your priorities are. FEMA will try, but you can kind of ignore them. Okay? What are the capabilities that you really think are a priority here? Now, those capabilities might be awareness and education. Those capabilities might be equipment. They might be training. They might be PPE, personal protective equipment. A whole variety of things that might be priorities that you want to try to build on and figure out how to obtain. Okay? But I can tell you right now, the expectations that we need to create about what we want people to do are very important, and they begin with awareness and education. Okay, if I'm having this kind of conversation in Oklahoma City and the tornado siren goes off, I can tell you that nobody is sitting in their chair. Everybody's gone to the shelter. I mean, there's just no screwing around. If I'm doing the same kind of presentation in Denver or somewhere else like that, and the tornado siren's going off, people have got their cell phones out looking for the tornado because they want to take a picture. Okay? So if we don't create awareness and some expectations, that's a problem. Okay? And I can't tell you the last time I ever heard on a public service basis anybody say, what do you do if you hear the tornado siren? Instead, people go, what is that noise? Why is it going off? Is it noon? I mean, what's the story? So we're not creating appropriate expectations because we're not talking to people about what's going into our plans and what it means. Got great plans. Plans say, yeah, these circumstances occur, we trigger these sirens and alerts. And then, okay, so that's part of the problem. So how do you do this? And it really ends up having to be a community-involved proposition. And that means you're going to sit people down in a room and you're going to say, and probably many rooms, many times, saying, really, here are the risks in our community, and here's the stuff we can and we can't do, and we need your participation in trying to fill those gaps. And it can be 1,000 small things that you're trying to accomplish to better prepare the community. Okay? When I've done this stuff in Ghana, we started with first aid training in the schools. And over the course of several years, you build up to where you've got an emergency response capability within that community that's based on a bunch of kids and teachers and other folks that have been able to acquire some equipment so they could actually maybe get somebody to the hospital alive. Okay? So
I don't know if any of our kids in our schools, some know, but how to put a Band-Aid on.
that's right. I mean, it's very true. Don't doubt it. But so it needs to be a community-involved process. So where's the best place to go for the community-involved process? In the U.S. and certainly in Colorado, it is the local emergency planning committee. That's why you want one. Okay, but it's a non-regulatory body. It collects information on hazardous materials, but it doesn't regulate anything. It doesn't tell people you can or can't have it. That's for fire codes and building codes and things like that. Okay, what it is, it's a place for the conversation. It's a place where the businesses can come in and say, hey, yeah, we handle lots of this bad stuff, but here are our safety programs, here's our training process, here's how you'll know if we're having a spill or release, okay, kind of event. Here's what it looks like. Here's what the hazards are. Okay? You're going to have another situation where the fire department talks about, here are what our hazmat capabilities are. This is the kind of stuff we can handle. This is why we don't just rush in and try to stop things. Maybe we're just going to let this burn for a really long time. Okay? That's always a possibility. So we don't talk about capability, we don't talk about limitations on capabilities. It's not like you've got to make everybody a chemist. But on the other hand, they need to understand if I hear a bang and I see a yellow cloud, what's my course of action? What do we as, well, that would be a good start. But within this community, what we expect them to do, we don't expect them all to grab their cell phones and run towards it.
Right.
Okay? That is what we don't want, but honestly, we don't
That's
have...
human nature, though.
Well, it might be, but that's why we're doing education. Try to defeat human nature a bit. Now, there's some cool advantages. Why don't you give me the next slide? There's some cool advantages to having an LAPC in Colorado. First off, any member of an LAPC has statutory immunity for any of these kinds of activities. So for all the planning activities. So there's no reason that the businesses shouldn't participate or individual citizens shouldn't participate. You don't have to be a government employee. We just paper over everybody with statutory immunity. Okay, that's pretty unique in the country, quite frankly, and has been pretty successful in getting people to the table in terms of what is doing in LAPC. So, what does LAPC should it do? Well, first off, it ought to be trying to figure out what the strategic plan is to fill gaps. Okay? And you can't do that without having a conversation with folks about where the gaps are. Okay? This little housing group here, if it floods, you can't get out or you can't get in. Okay? What can we do about that? Is there anything we can do about that? Can we make you more aware of it? Okay? Is there somebody there that needs medication, needs oxygen? Are we talking to people that require power? If they have power interruptions, how long can they survive on battery backup? Do we know where those folks are? We may know where some of them are, we probably don't know where all of them are. Okay? Do we know where we have enclaves in the community where you do not have enough English-speaking folks or access to communication that they'll get warnings in a timely fashion? Do we know when we're going to have to communicate with those folks in a way that is going to be specific to their needs and their circumstances?
That's the big problem is how do you communicate with these folks?
Yep.
You're not going to do it with the newspaper.
Nope.
There's 100 different radio stations, satellite, TV is the same way.
Yep.
Some people, most people have cell phones, some don't. Some have
Many
the
don't.
old phone on the wall.
Right. No, and what you end up doing is you have to end up approaching those communities. And what we have found historically is that there are usually small businesses in those areas that can tell you a great deal about the community. It might be, might be the Asian grocery store. It might be, this small business, might be the feed guy. Somebody has their fingers kind of embedded in that community, can tell you a lot about it, can tell you who the community leaders are there, can tell you how they get information now. How are they talking to each other? Because neighbors talk to neighbors, always have, always will. So how are they talking to each other now? They can tell you a lot, but you have to go talk to them. Okay, you can't just post something on the internet and assume people will read it. So it's a matter of engaging the community. And so you very likely have to start by going to them. But on the other hand, once you've done that and you can identify some people that are sort of leaders in that community, you can usually get them to work with you. Okay? There are nonprofit groups in a lot of these communities. You have a variety of businesses that are involved in doing routine deliveries. It might be medication, it might be other things in those communities. Physicians know a lot of these folks. Dentists know a lot of these folks. And then the faith-based community know a lot of these folks. And so you've got assets that can winnow it down a little bit in terms of the burden of talking to those folks. But what I can tell you is if you're not making an effort to talk to those folks, then you're very vulnerable for somebody saying, hey, look, from a civil rights point of view, you're violating these folks' civil rights because you're not adequately involving them in the planning process, which means they're not going to be served well in an emergency. Okay? And those kind of cases happen a lot, and I will tell you right now, if I put my lawyer hat on, where those cases are being brought is they're being brought in both big urban areas where there's political advantage and being brought in small rural areas because that's a place where you make law. Okay? Because you can get some of the most clear facts, some of the most egregious cases. We had a deal out on the Eastern Plains where you had a group of people that were trying to deal with advocates in the mobility impairment community, a bunch of people in wheelchairs, primarily vets. And they were making a lot of noise about the adequacy of evacuation, accessibility to shelters, things like that. And the response of that community was to start holding meetings in the basement EOC that didn't have an elevator. Okay, so, wrong approach. Immediate threatening litigation.
Yes.
Okay? And it's like, no. You got to engage. And the only way you engage is you have to explain what the community's capabilities really are. What can we do and what can't we do? And you need to look at those folks and say, you need to meet us part of the way here. Okay, what can you do? What can you bring to the table from a resources point of view? What do you know about other resources that are available out there? You potentially have access to grants and funding and other kinds of stuff that we've never heard of. So tell us about that stuff. Okay? So it's how you reach out. But in terms of measuring success, what I want to be able to do if I'm going to have to defend the planning process in this or any other community is I have to demonstrate I'm making an effort. Perfection is not the standard. Trying is the standard. Okay? And I have to really be showing that I'm doing the outreach. And I think what that means is I need to show that I'm making some progress on a strategic plan to fill gaps. Okay? Which means as I go out and talk about what the gaps are, what the priorities are, I've got to involve the whole community in that conversation. Okay? And then when I take some action, I need to actually show that it's successful. Writing a paper plan is worthless unless I can do an exercise that shows that some elements of it actually function and I can correct it. Writing an evacuation plan is worthless unless I actually try to make it work. Okay? Can I go out and approach some members of the community? We don't rarely do we involve the public in exercises. Okay, we don't very often go to the retirement home and say, hi, we want to practice evacuating. So we need you to identify a few folks here that will play with us and will evacuate them. Now, everybody freaked out about liability issues, which is why we did the state statute to create immunity, because every once in a while you drop somebody. But understanding that accidents happen nonetheless, if we're practicing and doing an exercise that demonstrates whether our plans work and we can make corrections on our plans, then that's advantageous to the ability to actually show that we're making progress. Okay? So, it's the plan, do, act cycle. I have to, in fact, demonstrate that what I think is going to work, works. Do my mutual aid agreements work? If I yell for help, am I calling the right number? For example. And if you say you guys have got this stuff, do you have it? And how realistic is mutual aid with the community down the road? Because they probably got the same disaster I've got. Okay? So all that stuff is important. We spend a lot of time with people saying, hey, I want to do a commodity flow study. And my response to that is, well, you're right. You could spend money doing a commodity flow study. That's within federal grant guidance. Why? Are you worried about what's coming down the road? Because any firefighter, sheriff's department, deputy, whomever can tell you what's on the road. They can see the placards. They can see what's moving. Are you worried about what's going down the road at 2 a.m. because of your staffing levels? Are you worried about whether you have exotic material that you don't have PPE for or detection equipment for? What information are you trying to glean when you do that? If I'm training for something, I'm going to send a whole bunch of people to training. Am I training them for something that's actually a risk in this community? Or am I training them for something because there was money for it and it seemed like a great idea? Well, if it's not a risk here, then I probably could have spent those resources somewhere else. Would make some sense. So I want to be measured, I want to be evaluated on the degree to which we're actually executing the strategic plan and filling the capability gaps, not in 2020 hindsight on the last bad day. Okay. Next slide. Thank you, sir. So the golden rules for LEPCs, NASPO stole these from the United Nations. They were originally created 20 years ago. And they originally applied to situations where multinational companies were going in the developing world and setting up chemical plants and things like that. Point is, you got to be honest about your capabilities. Okay? Within an LEPC setting or otherwise, we've got to be honest about what we can't do. Okay? No fire chief is going to put apparatus up a mountain county road with no way out in the face of crowning fire. He's not going to do it. Okay? People don't know that. And we need to also prove what the businesses and public will do. That means we need to go talk to them. If I say to the business owner, you and your employees have got to stay in here for maybe 24 hours. Can they do it? Or is it even a bigger disaster? Okay? If I tell members of the public I want them to shelter in place, are they utterly clueless as to what that means? The answer is yes, but we know that now. But we need to improve that proposition. We need to talk to people about, okay, if you smell smoke, if you see flames, you need to be thinking about leaving. Several years ago, we had a woman above Fort Collins who died in her house on the phone with the 911 operator, complaining about the fact that nobody ever told her to leave. Can't do that. Okay? We have to have a better situation where we're creating appropriate expectations through awareness and education. That should never be the thing. Okay? We want to be able to talk to people about their level of preparedness expectation, what we expect them to be able to do. I mean, if I'm talking to a business that employs 10, 20 people, now I'm talking to 10, 20 families in addition to just that business owner. That is a way of talking about the preparedness obligation. Okay? Yeah, no, we need to create a situation where, yeah, I'm worried about your property, but I'm also worried about whether you stay in business. Okay? Which means your employees have got to be able to get to work. They have to be safe because your employees aren't coming if their families aren't safe. Okay? So we need to spread that awareness. We need to spread that expectation for preparedness. And have very high expectations. Don't get, I mean, I'm not suggesting this isn't hard, and I'm not suggesting it isn't a pain to be out talking to people about preparing for stuff that they think is no big deal, that nobody's going to worry about. Okay? But if we don't do that, then we're giving them a free pass. Okay? And we need to be out of the business of giving people a free pass on this stuff. Okay? Or we will continue to have people drive around barriers and barricades and ignore warnings that are being stated. Not that that ever happens. So if you want to yell at me, that's how you do it. And the CPC is in the business of supporting LEPCs. Okay, we will get out the pom-poms and support LEPCs anytime we can, which is why I'm down here, because Jim asked. Okay, I probably do 3 or 4 of these a month with different county commission groups and others and city councils and people like that. Just so you understand that the burden that you've got here is recognizing that you've got to embrace the horror of answering hard questions from people that wonder why it is we don't have certain capabilities. And I don't care if that's Denver or the most remote part of the state, okay? Nobody can look at the situations and say, well, I don't have any capability gaps, I can handle everything. It's not true, okay? So, yeah, you got to answer tough questions. You got to explain people things that you've known for your entire working life, but they haven't got a clue about. You know, sometimes we use the word hazmat. And I've sat in audiences where I'm getting about half the people going, no idea what that means. It's a hazardous material. What's a hazardous material? You know, how do you define it? How do you describe it? You know, usually I go, something to kill or injure you. Okay, well, that's bad. Why do they have that? Well, they have good legitimate reasons to have that. Let's talk to them about what they do with it. Let's talk to them about their safety programs and their training programs. Let's, you know, look at the business owner to say, no, you talk to these people about why it is that you can safely use that product. And I don't care if it's chlorine or ammonia. You know, it's small quantity stuff.
Just don't mix them together.
Don't mix them together. That's a good idea. So, try to avoid those things. So, yeah, so it is difficult, but it's best done in the context of an LEPC. Because you guys don't want to do it. Okay, you need to have a public body that's broadly staffed, okay, that can call on resources and bring them together, but it's a group that is apolitical. Okay, that's how you convince all the various folks in the community that you can have a meaningful conversation. Okay, and try to create some priorities. And if they want to come back and talk to you about spending money on this and spending money on that, they can. But the money isn't the be-all, end-all, obviously, to any of this stuff. And we've always got to remember that we want high expectations. Hey, it's great you want us to do that. Now let's talk about what you're going to do. Okay, we used to talk about 72-hour kits. And you haven't heard that phrase in probably 2-3 years. And the reason for it's real simple. It wasn't a sustainable thing to go out and talk to the members of the public generally about having a 72-hour kit. Besides which, TSA won't let me bring mine on the airplane, so I won't have it. And if I'm in a hotel and somebody yells at that hotel manager, shelter in place, they're going to go, huh? So it's important to recognize that the burden really is within the community. Okay? We talk to ski areas all the time about, okay, passes are shut down, you're going to have to keep these people for another 2 days. What do you got? What are your capabilities? How much food do you have? You know, does your medical care disappear or not? Okay. So having expectations of all the community members to be a participant in the process is what's critical, and I think honestly LAPC is the place for that. So happy to take any questions.
Who appoints the members to the LEPC?
Half second. The CEPC approves both the planning district for the LEPC as well as the membership. It's a self-appointed proposition. State statute says that if we can't get county commissioners to agree to set up an LEPC, we can in fact designate the county commissioners to be the LEPC. CEPC's done that twice, very successfully, I will point out, because it immediately produced the desire to have an LEPC that wasn't them, as you might imagine. We did that to Pitkin County, and we did that to one of the Eastern Plains counties. It's like, it's not that hard, guys, really. I mean, this is not a great big mandate. We want you to have a committee. Okay, not too tough. So, here's how it starts. Okay, you need to point the finger at somebody to say, send the CEPC an initial roster. CEPC meets every other month. We will bless that roster, and then it just grows from there. Very basic bylaws, real simple kind of proposition, because what you're doing is collecting information. You collect reports, you can obtain information. You know, if the fire department or law enforcement agency says, so-and-so's got stuff, I can see it in their yard, I have no idea what it is and how hazardous it is. LEPCs have the authority to go find that out. Okay, so does the sheriff under the DARA statute. Is the sheriff the DARA for the county?
Yeah.
Okay, so designated emergency response authority, which is a really old statute that dates from, I don't know, from the days of the torpedoes rolling over in the mousetrap in Denver, which was a really long time ago. And the General Assembly was in session and they were inconvenienced, so that's why we have a DARA statute. But, yeah, I mean, they gather information, but send a roster, okay? And then you can grow it from there.
And as far as their interaction with the Board of Commissioners, it's just an advisory role?
Well, LEPCs can't tell commissioners to do anything.
Right, that's why
Okay,
it's
and
advisory.
we're not looking, LEPCs are generally not funded by the counties. LEPCs generally get funding to the extent they're even funded by donations from business community, philanthropic groups within the community or otherwise. Most LEPCs operate on a budget of a couple $100, which generally gets spent on coffee and donuts and things like that for meetings. Okay, but you can get pretty much everything you need locally. We have several places in the state where we're operating nonprofits that are for the purpose of funding local emergency preparedness activities. A real successful one in the southeast part of the state, where basically they've been able to raise thousands of dollars that go into search and rescue and volunteer ambulance and things like that, and it's all kept locally. So it's not a federal grant, it's not a state grant. And so you can knock on the door of the car dealer and say, I'm looking for $100 or $500 to go into this kind of stuff, and usually you can get that. So so you have a nonprofit corporation, which can be really useful. And then you're not hamstrung by the funding constraints of the grant terms. Like there's a grant called HMEP, which I imagine Jim's talked about several times. But that's a grant from the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. And it's got all kinds of red tape associated with it. And it's got all kinds of restrictions on it that are just unwieldy and a big pain, okay? Whereas you can go to a nonprofit group and say, here's my project, here's what I need, here's my accountability, here's what I'm going to measure when I'm done, and potentially get a grant directly. That's exactly what you want. And there's a fair amount of that going on right now. We have, on the statewide basis, we have a group called, a nonprofit called the Colorado Emergency Preparedness Partnership, that on request will do a lot of this risk assessment, capability assessment stuff. Okay, and that's just a matter of Jim knows who. It's a matter of calling them up and getting on the calendar for it, and a lot of their funding comes from a couple big statewide foundations. So there's no state federal money in that party at all. Now, people have figured out that, federal government and state government try to do grant programs, they never fit with what you're trying to accomplish. And so the philanthropic community tends to be a lot more flexible. And you have foundations here. Okay, you have businesses here that can write you a check for $100, and it's tax deductible, of course. So there are ways to fund these things without being overly reliant on federal money or state.
I mean, the asking for all of these donations, I mean, that's a full-time job within itself.
It can be, although it can be. LAPC members are usually pretty good at it. And so if I'm not raising money for an LAPC, it's a matter of talking to 2 or 3 people. Okay, I'm not trying to get $20 here and $20 there. I've got a project-specific ask that I'm trying to do. And, you know, it's like I want to, for example, the most recent one was we want to run an exercise involving mobility prepared community, and we want to demonstrate that the wheelchair lift bus equipped buses will work if we need to use them. And so we're talking to the folks that are in that residential setting, and we're talking to the folks that own the van, in other words, and we're trying to figure out how to fund that. So you got to pay people to drive it. You've got some incidental expenses, but it's a matter of coming up with a number and knocking on the door of the foundation and saying, here's what I want to do. Or in this case, a fair amount of the money actually came from the local Dodge dealer, okay, who was happy to cut a check for $2,000. Sure, this is a great project. Use my van, it says Dodge on the front, it's great. Okay, fine, terrific, I don't care. So we can do that kind of demonstration, and if you're very focused rather than just trying to do general fundraising, I mean, this is not, your big Trout Unlimited, Ducks Unlimited kind of funding effort. It's a matter of being pretty focused on what you want to do with the money, and then talking to people that might have an interest in it, that want to show that, yeah, you can be successful, this is great. And so you can find that kind of money. It doesn't have to be a full-time proposition. But what you start with is creating that kind of community organization, the local emergency planning committee, as the forum for these conversations. Okay.
Do you have anything else?
No.
No, he knows how to
Anything
find
else,
things.
Jim?
No, that's why I have somebody that's a lot more articulate and knowledgeable in this, but yeah, I wouldn't be, I've got enough on my plate, but I would be part of the LAPC. I have a lot of great volunteers that are, one of them's back there that actually would be the chair of it, and we get all these partners together. It'd be like, I was the chair of the Southwest Colorado Special Olympics. So from here to Walsenburg, I had that coverage, and I would put together different entities and different businesses in this. And I'd say, I need $3,000. I got to run these kids from there to there. And they, like that, I'd have $3,000. And because we're nonprofit, we can do anything with it. We can put the Dodge stickers on our cars. We can do anything.
So the LAPC then becomes a 501c3 organization within this community?
I generally wouldn't go to that much trouble.
So then
Okay.
how does it have a nonprofit status without?
It has, what it is, it's a community organization. It typically doesn't even have a bank account, okay, unless you're really going to raise a bunch of money, in which case go down as an unincorporated association to the local bank and open the account. It ends up being a business expense rather than a charitable deduction for businesses. So most businesses say, I'm going to participate in community emergency planning because A, it protects me. So that ends up being a very valid business expense to cut a $100 check or $500 check to the local emergency planning committee to stick in its bank account for this project or that project. So That normally isn't an issue. There used to be a big trend to try to incorporate LEPCs as nonprofits, but frankly, the burden of keeping up your nonprofit status ended up being a big enough hassle that the only ones I'm aware of now are in New Mexico. And Albuquerque's has got one that has been that way for quite a while. We used to do several like that in Colorado, but those have all kind of gone by the wayside, and they now just operate as unincorporated associations with their own bank accounts.
Which is mostly made up then of businesses.
Well, it'll be businesses, it'll be individuals. The membership of the LEPC can be a moving target, okay? But it's basically anybody that is willing to come to a meeting and not throw a chair. So if you can sit in a meeting politely and have a conversation about preparedness issues, you can be a member of the LEPC. We have LEPCs in this state that are 60-some people. And that tends to be in areas where you've got a lot of volunteer groups. Rural areas do this. Make everybody a member of the LEPC to get the immunity protection of the statute. Okay, and so we've got folks that are engaged in volunteer ambulance, search and rescue, all kinds of stuff that are members of the LEPC in order to cloak them with the immunity.
So do you have a, what's the term I want to use? Somewhat of an LEPC setup or forming right now?
We're on.
But it's informal, it's not really formal.
Ours is a formal regional emergency planning committee.
But not
So
local.
5 counties, 2 tribes, we have funding in there. And we're noticing more and more that we're going to keep the regional committee so we can all meet and still have those discussions regionally, but most of us are now going to get our own local ones because a lot of people involved in this regional are actually Montezuma County, a lot of us. So we're going to develop a local one because it gets more in depth in our local issues and not regional.
So the region is still our 5 counties?
Yeah,
Dolores,
5
Montezuma,
counties and
Plata,
2
Artemis.
tribes. And if we're going to go with all hazards district, I think San Miguel County is now added to it, but I'm not positive. I know that's
Yeah,
part of
that's
DHSEM's regional, so that might be 6 counties and 2 tribes.
Which you're not stuck with. Okay, we have several examples where we've got counties with LEPCs that are also part of a regional LEPC.
Correct.
And part of the reason that works is the mutual aid is regional. You're going to be relying on counties down the road for any kind of mutual aid assistance. But there's enough going on within the county and enough of these conversations that need to occur within the county to justify having your own LEPC. What I can pretty well guarantee to you is that if the CPC gets a roster, it'll be blessed
What
by
about
return mail.
reaching across state lines?
Yes, you can do that. Okay, and you do that with, and it's a very interesting process, but you do it by essentially a fairly simple mutual aid kind of agreement.
Okay.
And that's easily done.
What about letting Denver know we're in the state of Colorado?
That's harder. That has some difficulty, especially when we do redistricting.
I don't think they know what the word Cortez is.
Oh, yes, they do. Trust me. Yes, they do.
Yeah.
COVID, trust me, and I'll be on a governor's call tonight. They know we exist.
Yeah.
Good.
So with that, that's a good question because I was planning on putting the emergency manager from San Juan County to the south and San Juan County to the west, and they're like awesome. They're exactly what we need on that committee. And I'm working on Arizona. We kind of got a gap there, but
Yeah.
these two are
That's a hard
great.
reach.
Yeah,
That's hard.
yeah.
We
And
have
What's that,
approved.
Apache County? Is that Apache
Yes.
County?
Apache County, and then the Navajo Nation used to be part of some of the things we did in the past, but a lot of people have left, so I have to build relationships with them, but that was part of my plan as well down the road.
You'd have more chances going with the chapter houses than you would the total tribe, I would think.
I think so.
We've approved LAPC rosters with people from neighboring states, in every corner of the state, frankly. So that's no big deal. You can bring in people, make them members of the LAPC here.
Yeah, it might not look as bad if they were in this, especially San Juan County, Utah, in case we decide to invade them again.
Yeah, there you go. Right, exactly. Okay. Well, anyway, he knows how to find me, and I think, you task him with getting an initial LAPC roster sent in to the CEPC. That's the place to start.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet
Nice to
you.
meet you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Tim.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have Wildfire Adapted Partnership, Mr. Graff.
Maybe we should get him a seat up here.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That was a great presentation. Now gets into what I'm going to talk about a little bit today here. There we go. Thanks. Now I can hear my own voice. Yeah, so first off, I want to thank the board and Shaq for having me today, giving me some time to say my piece. I really appreciate it. And before I start today, I don't want to give the wrong impression at all. I want to start off by saying thank you to the county for supporting Wildfire Adapted across the board in the past and the present. It makes a huge difference for us. And I want to start off by saying we're incredibly grateful for all the funding that we've received over the years and even to this day. So I think Shaq sent around a letter to the commissioners, and I hope you guys took a minute to read that or take a look at it. That kind of lays out a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, but I'll cut to the chase. So what
Last paragraph.
What's that?
Last paragraph.
Yeah, right. What I'm here today to ask for is an increase in funding in the 2021 fiscal year. We received $2,500 this fiscal year, which is, like I said, we're incredibly grateful for. It makes a huge difference. But I'm going to get into a couple things a little bit down the road here, which is reason for, I think, asking for more this year. And so we're asking for $15,000, so an increase of $12,500, given that the county already committed $2,500. So I don't think I have to tell anybody about the drought year this year. It's pretty obvious, although this last week and the week to come hopefully is going to give us a little bit of a sigh of relief, but it's just one drop. It seems like it's not going to change fire danger that much. Tim was talking a lot about non-political organization that's talking to people about realistic risks, and that's exactly what I'm doing day in and day out. Talking with landowners, talking about risk, talking about the reality of wildfire in their backyard, basically. So that's what Wildfire Adapted does. We're all about preparedness, about protecting property, homes, structures, and people's lives at the end of the day. And so we're talking about money today, or I am, and, not to toot my own horn, but I think that you really can't put a price tag on, protecting someone's home, protecting someone's life. So kind of a little bit more of the why am I here today. You can ask any person in the fire or in the emergency management world. It's not, especially in the West, mainly in the West and in our county, it's not if a fire happens, but it's when. So this education planning is very crucial, and Wildfire Adapted for a long time has relied on federal grants. It's a lot of what Tim was talking about federal money. As this large-scale drought has happened over the West, and as we've seen these big mega fires, the federal funding that has been there, the size in our perspective hasn't really changed, but there are a lot more people trying to access those funds. And it makes it a lot more difficult for a small organization in rural Colorado to be competitive against, California. Sorry. And again, like I said, you can't put a price tag on people's lives, people's homes. Every person's home and every person's life in this county is as important as anywhere else where the grant funding is going to go. I'll step back from that and just say, I don't think that we can rely just on the feds to throw money at the situation. What I'm asking today is for a bit more local investment into wildfire preparedness. And to me, it's all about, my world is all about education. People aren't going to act if they don't even know what the issue is. And as we've already talked about today, common sense, right? Well, I think I know what common sense is, but I don't think there's much consensus a lot of the times about what common sense is. And sure, clearing around a home, right, seems like common sense. Well, just don't have too much fuels around your home. But surprisingly, it's not common sense in my experience. And also, we've had a lot of folks moving here from other states where wildfire is not a concern, really. So basically what I'm saying is that with an increase in funding, I can do a lot more education. I can create a lot more awareness. It is a time-consuming activity, and it's, my approach is never, just throw it on the radio or throw it on Facebook. Sure, maybe those can help, but for me, it's all about one-on-one interactions with homeowners on their property, and that's what I do all summer. 1 to 2 hour visits, site assessments with homeowners, telling them specifically what they should do, getting their expectations about what response is actually going to be like in a worst case scenario. That's what I do day in and day out. And right now we're in a bit of a struggle to find funding to continue to do that. And I know for a fact that I can do more of it, given more funding.
Who are your funding sources right now, Alex?
Sure. Right now we have a couple grants from the feds, from Forest Service, to help us do incentive programs to do mitigation work around structures. We have a state grant but it's not in this county. We have a little bit from Bureau of Land Management, and neighbors, HOAs making contributions, and the county.
Do any of the municipalities help?
Not in Montezuma County.
Okay.
In other counties. Yeah. It's a good question. Yeah. Yeah, so I don't want to take up too much time.
What does it take to run your organization annually?
That would be a question for our executive director. I can get you those numbers, absolutely. To be honest, I'm not involved in that kind of like that level of strategic planning per se. I can get you that information, though,
Sure.
absolutely.
I mean, it's just a question I'm going to ask is,
Yeah.
what does it take to run your organization? How many's in your organization?
Sure.
And geographically, what are the biggest problems in this county? Not Dolores County or anywhere else, but what are your biggest focuses within this county geographically? Is it south? I mean, what does the Ute tribe donate to you? What is, the municipalities? Where's your funding source come from? What is
Right.
what does it amount to, and what does it take to run your organization?
Right. Yeah. I don't have all the information on that because my day-to-day is focused on talking to people. I'm
Sure.
less on the planning side, but yeah, absolutely.
And then my next question is, just like Tim said, if you can get out there and ask other people, are these people willing, once you serve them, to create that donation to you after your services have been rendered?
Yeah, and that's something we always
I
ask.
guess, yeah.
Yeah, and that's
how successful are you with that?
I'd say, 50% of the time, maybe a little bit less, we might be getting a donation from, a site visit that I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say a lot less than that. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but yeah, that's something we're always asking for. But in terms of just what I think is on my plate and the amount of education and outreach that needs to be done, you know, if 100% of the time we got that, maybe things would be different.
So is it, where mostly are you outreaching here locally?
I mean, I'm doing outreach across the board, you know, I would say, but the communities I work with 40 communities specifically in Montezuma County, and those are kind of self-selecting because those are communities that have ambassadors that have gone through education that we provide for them and then talk to their neighbors and say, well, these are the risks. We try to delegate that. So, I mean, it spans across the county. I have a map. There's a link in my letter to kind of show you where some of those are. You know, and again, they're somewhat self-selecting. We're not forcing anybody to come forward. It's on a voluntary basis. Yeah, so this is the map. Yeah, it's more in the red areas, I guess, of private land in the county. So these are subdivisions that we work with. Yeah, does that answer the question?
So you don't charge a fee for your assessments,
Right.
but do you go in later and do mitigation for the same people?
We don't do any of the mitigation. I provide recommendations, and then they can get, you know, contractor to do the work. Yeah, so we're not firing up any chainsaws.
Right, you're just strictly education and assessment.
Okay. Yeah, but you know, a site assessment is open to anybody. You know, anywhere in the county you can sign up for a site assessment, and I'll drive out and do one. There are no limitations on where I go. I go anywhere.
And you work with the contractors on like the chipper?
So yeah, we have some other programs. We have a chipper rebate program to help people offset some of the cost of chipping. You know, these come from grants that were written in specific ways. Yeah, so I have relationships with contractors. We don't recommend specific contractors, but yeah, there are other programs that we have that are available to people. You know, but the site assessment is really that piece of outreach and education that I think that is the catalyst that gets people to actually act, right? Because you can shout from the top of a mountain, you know, fire mitigation is important, like there's risk, but unless you're talking to somebody face to face, they're gonna say, cool, and then walk away. That's kind of what it takes, and that's what specifically that increase in funding would go towards. You know, there's a lot more to do, there's a lot more I could do, but it just takes more funding for us, and that's my ask today. And yeah, I'm happy to answer more questions too.
I'm like Jim, I'd like to see more of your financial stuff and what it takes to run your
Sure.
deal. And
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can
I mean,
have.
I think, and I'm speaking for me, and probably like Tim said, you know, I can't imagine the average person not realizing that fire, and specifically in the drought that we're in and have been in, that wildfire is not a risk.
Right.
And it's a very high risk or an extreme risk. So I was just wondering, you know, how many people are you really talking to that have no idea? Because that seems to me very bizarre, that they have no idea within this county. I'm not talking La Plata, Dolores, or Archuleta here that this map shows, but within our county, I think it's,
Yeah,
I think it exists, and it's, unless it's new people. So I was just curious, you know,
Yeah.
what
How do
are
you
your
reach those
financials?
people?
What do they look like? And where are you really reaching out to? Are they people, newcomers? What are they?
I mean, it's an interesting conversation because I think there's a difference between being aware of the risk and then the next step, which is actually doing something about it. And that's what I'm trying to get people to do. So yeah, you're totally right. I'm not saying
Because an
people are on-
assessment is an assessment. It's not, it's saying, okay, you should, I mean,
Right.
trust me, I get it. I know
Yeah.
what you're doing, but you can't force
No.
that individual, even after the assessment, to go take,
It's like advice.
correct.
You can
it's-
either
it's
take it or
advice.
not.
That is what it
So
is
I
at the
think
end of the
that
day.
We all understand where you're at. I would just like to see more of your financial situation and what you're actually doing before.
Sure thing.
And it's, that was set a year ago.
Yep.
Or I
Yeah.
shouldn't say a year ago, it was set a year ago.
Yeah.
So these two gentlemen don't have,
And
Or did not
how do you
have any
approach
knowledge
these
of it.
people? Do you just go out into the community and,
We operate mostly off of word of mouth. I think before it was said neighbors talk to neighbors, right? And so that's kind of the point of having these ambassadors in these neighborhoods. We don't go knocking on doors and tell people what to do. We have people in the communities who know their neighbors, who talk to their neighbors, who know how to talk to their neighbors, and have them pass along information for me. So yeah, we're never. It would be a horrible path to take if we just went in and started telling people what to do, and we're not interested in doing that.
right.
Yeah.
Which we can't do that in.
Yeah.
No, and I think some of this
how
is,
you approached it? Because I live right in the middle of one of those big red deals there, and I've never been approached by anyone. So
yeah. I think some of the fire guys, I know, as a firefighter, I used to go through all my district and just say hi to people and say, you probably need to have an assessment done. Back then, 40 years ago, we did the assessment as firefighters. And now I believe that a couple of our fire chiefs are actually, referring the communities or the HOAs to Alex. And I've been doing that with the CWPP that I'm working on. So I think a lot of referrals are getting back to Alex that way. And then when he does his magic, I don't know the percentage, but I do know that they're like, I guess we ought to get ready for the big one, right? So it's kind of a mixed bag. It's pretty tough because some people go, it's not going to happen, or it's going to run the top of the trees and it's going to wipe us out anyway, so we don't care, So.
Yeah, I like to think I'm pretty persuasive though.
Okay.
Great.
Gentlemen, anything else?
No, I have nothing.
no good.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I'm more than happy to follow up with some
Yeah, if you could
financials.
just send that information to Shaq, and then
Yeah.
it'll be a discussion.
Great. Thanks for your time. Appreciate it. Have a good day.
You
Thank
bet,
Yeah,
thank you.
Alex.
Yep.
And if I can have 2 minutes of your time, where's your timer?
Oh, I
So-
got it
He
right
left.
here.
You better start it when I say 2 minutes.
You got 1 minute and 47 seconds.
All right, cool. So I've got some great ideas. I want you to get this and chew on it, and we'll have a further discussion on it, and I'll get you more information. But the state, I've been working with the grant people in the state. So we have the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant, the BRIC grant. And then we have the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, the HMGP. And then we have Flood Management Assistance, the FMA grant programs. All of these, like Tim was saying, you can kind of mold it for some of it, and some of it you can't. But I was talking to the state guy up there. So he gave me I've got all the applications. I can play this. If it's in the hazard mitigation plan that I put in, there's a good chance that whoever applies for the grants, and it can be up to it can be up to $1 million, I think, but if we apply for $10,000 in grants or 20, the county, if you decided, the county would pay like 12.5% of that, and we can get the grant. Or I can have sub-grantees. So we could get Alex to be sub-grantee with WAP, and guaranteed that the owners would pay back 25% of this money, unless it's in the HMP, and then it would be around 12 and a half. And correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but, so we could be the sub-grantee, we would be the pass-through. We wouldn't have to pay anything other than Phaedra and a pass-through, working the grant and making sure that the information's correct. But we can do that. It's for mitigation work, one of the grants. The other one is for post-fires. And we were thinking about doing some weed controls on some of these other areas that we really haven't touched. And I know Bonnie and I have been talking about getting some post-fire mitigation done. And then the Hawkins Preserve, talking with Rebecca, she's interested in doing some of that restoration, and some of the owners down on the private land on the west side of that Hawkins fire, they're interested as well. So there's a lot of interest. It's just a matter of whether we want to be a pass-through for that stuff. And then if we want to put in 12.5% and the community then puts in the other 12.5, kind of partner share that 25% as well. Just something to chew on. But I've got all the information on that, and I still don't know if I have it down pat on what it really does, but.
Let me ask you this, Jim.
Sir.
2,500 that we gave wildfire adapted is 12.5% of $20,833. Could we count that 2,500 as the 12.5% match?
Not now. But we could, if we decided to put another 2,500 in when we apply for the grant, that could be part of that percentage. I'm done.
You're not even close.
That was
to
3
done.
minutes. That was 3 minutes.
Oh, nice, thank you. I like 3 minutes.
3 minutes is 150% of 2 minutes.
Chew on that one.
Yeah.
It's something to play with. So. You want here or over there?
We'll chew on it. Okay.
All right, thanks, guys.
All right.
Yeah. Onward.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Move we go into executive session for discussion of a personnel matter under CRS 24-6-402 parentheses 4 parentheses F asterisk.
I'll second it.
Well, it's floating around here somewhere.
So it has been moved and seconded that we go into executive session for discussion of personnel matters under CRS 24-6-402 parentheses 4 parentheses F with the asterisk. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 You've got to mention who's going to be in the executive session.
We're all leaving. It's just going to be you.
It will be Ms. Purcell, Commissioner Stevenson, Candelaria Lindsay, Administrator Powers, and Attorney Ian McLaren.
Okay, we are on YouTube.
Go ahead, Joel.
I make a motion that we come out of executive session.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to come out of executive session, and we will continue our regular session of this workshop. Gentlemen, do you have anything else to discuss as far as matters for this workshop? Oh, all in favor? Sorry.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, well then, at that point in time, I will entertain,
I move that we adjourn this work session.
Second.
been moved and seconded to adjourn this work session of 6:28:21. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.